Oh, right. Uh, what a week it's been, right? And so I'll just start by noting when Donald Trump was elected and took office in 2017, on his first day in office, he issued one executive order. On Monday of last week, he issued 26 executive orders. And there is just an onslaught, right, of new initiatives coming out of this administration that indicate really a 180-degree pivot, not only from his predecessor, and obviously, right, Donald Trump is a vindictive man. He's trying to do everything he can to dismantle what Joe Biden did, in part because Joe Biden did it. But also, I want to say that this is a full frontal attack on the post New Deal state, and that in many respects, the movement in American politics of the last 50 years, the movement in the direction of neoliberalism, of dismantling the regulatory authority of the state, of trying to create a much more market oriented society in which how you do depends on how you do economically within an unregulated market, that agenda has perhaps its most active, its most fully committed advocate in Donald Trump. And at the same time, that agenda is not particularly popular. And so that there's a great deal of other stuff coming out of Washington, the attack, for instance, on natural birthright citizenship, for citizenship for a naturally born person, anyone who is born in the United States, and that in a sense, I suspect, right, that's all political theater. That's not going to be upheld. Some of what's coming out of Washington is not much stronger than tweets, even though we have the president holding up the document that he's signed with his gaudy signature. The idea that in essence there's a bread and circus element to the first week of Donald Trump's presidency, an effort to argue that he's keeping his promises to his base, to his constituency, at the same time that a substantial portion of what he promised he cannot deliver on, right? And so I've tried to analyze with you in November and December the basis of Donald Trump's victory in 2024, and I've suggested to you that it boils down for the majority of the votes that actually got him elected to the proposition that he will increase wages and decrease prices, that Americans will be economically better off. And by the way, it's going to be really hard to deliver on either of those promises. And some of his most firm commitments, some of the issues that were the centerpiece of his campaign, massive deportations, tariffs, are likely to be, in fact, counterproductive in this regard. And so that, right, you know, the idea that the war in the Ukraine would end on Trump's first day in the office. Obviously, that's not happening. So instead, we're going to talk about, right, annexing Greenland and invading Panama and renaming the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of this is just pure spectacle political theater. But I do think a fair bit of it is more serious. And some of it will, in fact, be accomplished through executive orders alone. And so I want to try to do a little bit of sorting wheat from chaff in today's class, and also to think a little bit about where we started last week, what kind of resistance would be effective, and whether or not the fact that Donald Trump is being so aggressive, right? And one of the things we know from the campaign is that the Democrats really tried to target him with Project 2025. And Donald Trump tried to disavow Project 2025, to say he didn't know anything about it and it wasn't his agenda. And now it appears that Project 2025 is, in a sense, the tip of the iceberg. of this incoming administration, that it was poised, it was ready, that the 26 uh, right executive orders followed by more and more actions on each day is a kind of strategy that is sometimes called flood the zone, sometimes called overwhelm us cognitively and politically, to create a kind of right paralysis on the part of the Democratic Party and sources of opposition. They don't know what to focus on. They don't know which measures to take seriously. There's so many of them. So again, I'd like to try to do a little bit of analysis today in terms of what we should be most concerned about, but then also to continue this line of thought from last week. Is this an opportunity? Not really for the mainstream institutional Democratic Party. I think one of the things that has been mainly disappointing in the last week is the quietism, the acquiescence of the Democratic Party on issues like immigration. I think that there's a mainstream consensus inside the Beltway that Joe Biden was too liberal on immigration, and that as a result, the Democrats need to not be too far to the left. They'll just make Trump more popular if they resist too aggressively. And so the resistance, it seems to me, probably needs to come from other places, not from our elected officials, not from our mainstream institutions, not from our macro politics. Obviously, the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress. They have a supermajority on the Supreme Court, and they have this man in the presidency. We shouldn't expect those institutions to check and balance much of the Trump agenda. What we might hope for, as opposed to that, is civil society organizing, what is sometimes called the meso level, not the micro level, not the macro level, but unions, other organizations around specific issues, environmental organizations, immigrants' rights organizations, gaining strength over the Trump presidency because they are provoked by the aggression, the recklessness, the destructiveness, and frankly, the self-destructiveness of a fair number of these initiatives. So that's a little bit of where I want to go today. Let me start with some of the analysis of the policies. There's an effort, I think, straight out of the gates to try to address what Donald Trump viewed as, what his supporters view as a major limitation of his first term in office, which is that the federal government, the administrative agencies, federal employees did not actually follow Donald Trump's orders, did not sufficiently conform to his will, his policy, his priorities. And this is, of course, described in the exaggerated rhetoric of the deep state. I think there is something to be said for the idea that this is a frustration that not only Donald Trump has, but that frankly almost every president, almost every cabinet level official has, which is that the federal bureaucracy is vast, that civil servants are appointed on the basis of merit and to fulfill statutory descriptions of their position, requirements, and that doesn't change when a new president comes in, right? The bureaucracy remains the same, but also so too does the statutory authority and requirement on the part of the civil servants. And they recognize that the reason Congress created the agency, funded it, allowed for the creation of their position is so that their position fulfills the duties associated with the office, with the law, and that's often very different from what the president wants them to do. So having said that, one immediate effort is to reshape the executive branch and the civil service so that it is more likely to be an effective instrument of Donald Trump for the next 4 years. And so the ideas here, and I will emphasize mainly two of them as I think most important. One of them is restoring the Schedule F employment category in the federal executive branch. And this is a classification of federal employees that makes them not political employees per se, I'm sorry, political appointees per se, but accountable for following the will of the president and able to be fired if they do not sufficiently toe the line of the current administration, right? And that's a classification that Donald Trump tried to revive in his first term in office. It got caught up in court. Then, right, Joe Biden rescinded that effort. The question will be, does it go further in the second Trump term? The message that's being sent is that this administration is going to be much more attuned to whether or not federal employees actually follow its priorities, and it will do everything in its power to punish those who won't. You may have seen with the DEI, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, there's a across the board, again, executive order to immediately disband all such efforts, but then also a further demand that all federal employees report any instances of non-compliance with that first order, presumably so that the people who maybe covertly continue to try to pursue an agenda of diversity, equity, and inclusion are then sanctioned or fired. A second aspect of this is to end remote work policies and order all federal workers back to the office. And this will be slowly rolled out agency by agency. It's not an immediate order. But I just want to focus for a second on the background, on the logic of this. And I'll start, and this may be a little bit less true of federal employees than other employees, but that on average, Americans work more than any other employees in the developed world. And the data here are staggering, right? You know, we work maybe 30 or 40% more hours per week than do employees in most European countries. You add to that much of the work is in cities that it's hard to afford to live in. Washington, D.C. is another example of this. And the result is that people are forced to the outskirts, the suburbs, the right exurbs of the cities, and then they have to commute, and that the average American's commute is 2 to 3 hours a day. And you can begin to see why the ability to work from home, the ability to do your work on your computer, to zoom into meetings, is attractive to many American workers. You add to that many federal employees are relatively undercompensated relative to what they might make on the free market. There are advantages. Obviously, the pension and other benefits are good. The job stability is good. The ability to retire relatively early is good. But having said that, I believe you should read the subtext of several of these orders as an effort to purge the federal civil service of people who don't like Donald Trump and his agenda, who would be unlikely to cooperate with it, and who therefore, right, Trump would like out and like to be able to replace with people who his appointees get to hire, and get to hire on the basis of greater sympathy, greater loyalty to Trump's policy agenda. So I think it's appropriate to read this as part of a broader effort to remake the executive branch. The theory here that is used within conservative legal circles, and certainly that Trump's team subscribes to, is the theory of the unitary executive. The idea that everybody in the executive branch ultimately works for the president, and the president should have authority to direct everybody in the executive branch in ways that we've talked about before. The, I think, fundamental structural development of the federal government over the course of the 20th century is the development of the administrative state and administrative agencies, right? All these three-letter agencies, there's over a dozen of them. They receive a large portion of the funding of the federal government. They do a large portion of the work of promulgating, updating, adapting, and enforcing regulations. And in a sense, they're neither fish nor fowl. They're neither fully executive nor fully congressional. These agencies are created via congressional legislative action and with statutory mandates, but they are formally part of the executive branch, and their heads are appointed by the President of the United States. Should those agencies be treated as completely under the control of the President of the United States? They have not been in their nearly 100-year history understood that way. Donald Trump is going to try to remake them. And so the idea that Donald Trump is straight out of the gate using executive action, not pursuing a legislative agenda through Congress, despite the fact that his party controls both houses of Congress, that he is not only trying to deeply alter federal policy, he's also trying to restructure government so that the president has more unilateral authority within the executive branch, and so that the executive branch is more powerful vis-a-vis other branches and can function in certain respects almost as an alternative to the legislature, is, I think, again, part of what we're seeing in this fusillade of executive action in the first week. The area of policy that I think many of us are most concerned about: immigration and the border. And here there have been a variety of initiatives, barring asylum, suspending the refugee admissions program. I think it's worthwhile to think about the history here for a moment, right? The United States not only signed treaties in the aftermath of World War II, it was extremely influential in drafting those treaties. Those treaties were a response to the failure of the United States and many other countries to provide refugees for Jews trying to escape Nazi Germany. The famous stories of the ships being sent harbor to harbor, passengers not being allowed to disembark. The United States and other countries said, we won't let this happen again. Let us put this into the foundational charters of international law. And the Trump administration is saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And by the way, it's worthwhile noting that the Biden administration was very liberal on asylum and refugee policy, that it created an app and various mechanisms for people to be able to come to this country with provisional approval, right? To come to the country and await a hearing to determine whether or not they were, in fact, qualified for asylum status. The people coming from the Ukraine, coming from Haiti, coming from the Sudan, right? There are, I think, Afghanistan, a fair number of people who clearly there's a presumption qualify for this status. That is being suspended by the Trump administration. And there is a sense that millions of people who, although they don't have visas, although in that sense they don't have permanent legal authority to be in this country, nevertheless came to this country via permitted pathways. And we are talking about millions of people that the Trump administration is going to start deporting them rather quickly. We add to that then the idea that ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Administration, has been given immediate authority to enter hospitals, churches, and schools, places that have not typically been subject to ICE raids. Usually it's a home or a factory where ICE raids. The idea that an emergency order has been declared under the description of what's happening in terms of immigration as an invasion. And here I think it's important to recognize both the effects, but also the logic of that order. The effect is to allow for the militarization of the southern border, for the U.S. military to be involved in immigration enforcement at the southern border, which may liberate some of the ICE agents and Border Patrol agents to do more work in the interior of the country, to do more work, that is to say, on deportation of people who are already in the country. But then also, I think the rhetoric, the underlying emotional register of this order is to say these people are not people who are trying to temporarily escape terrible conditions, people who, in a sense, have for hundreds of years come to this country, starting with the Pilgrims, right? It's their story. But instead, they're invaders. They're um, hordes. They're people who are trying to break into our country in order to take it over and deprive those who are here legally, who are citizens or have visas, of their rights, right? The idea that this is an invasion and an emergency is an indication of a recategorization of people, referring them not just as being here illegally, but as being illegal, right? These are illegal immigrants, is a way of categorizing them so that they have no rights, so that they are seen as fundamentally other and different from us, so that they are seen as alien and hostile to our ways of life. This goes back to their eating cats and dogs. They're so unlike us that they are doing things that seem to be a fundamental violation of our folk ways, right? And so I think that you add to this the idea of limiting birthright citizenship, right? A fundamental principle written into the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, one that has been upheld and interpreted in relatively liberal and permissive ways by the Supreme Court for over a century now. An initiative that was immediately blocked by a judge, right, who did not, in fact, overturn it, but issued a temporary injunction, but who also said, and I think this gives you a little bit of a sense, and please note that he's a Reagan appointee, this judge, he's not an Obama or Biden appointee. And please note that at least at the lower levels, two-thirds of the federal bench was appointed by either Barack Obama or Joe Biden. And so I think we can anticipate that this will happen a lot with some of these Trump initiatives. The lower courts will hold against him. Of course, there is a two-thirds conservative majority in the Supreme Court, a supermajority. And ultimately, many of these questions will get to the Supreme Court. We'll have to see. But the judge, when he in the initial hearing spoke to the representatives of the Trump administration, he said, I find it hard to believe that you've been admitted to the bar if this is what you're maintaining on the basis of your position, right? And so a great deal of skepticism about this in the initial hearings. The idea, and this comes back to the initial conversation we were having, will California, will San Francisco, will Los Angeles, will other liberal jurisdictions in the United States not cooperate with the Trump deportation policies? And here, again, I think a little bit of history is helpful. The president who deported more people in a single term than any other president is Barack Obama, right? And that's in his first term in office. He's enforcing a law that was passed by his predecessor, Bush, and he's doing so in part because it is the law and he feels he has no choice but to enforce it. In part, I think, because he recognizes that it would be a political liability not to be seen as relatively aggressive in enforcing immigration law. I think, in essence, the 4 years of the Biden administration show that Obama probably read the political currents of public opinion correctly on that issue. But coming back now, right, to the question, why was Obama so effective? A large part of the reason he was so effective in deporting people is that a variety of states and localities cooperated with the Obama administration. That when people who did not have authorization to be in the country were arrested for relatively minor local offenses, pulled over, and they didn't have appropriate identification, the arresting jurisdiction turned them over to immigration services for deportation. And that during Trump's first administration, there was not that cooperation. Frankly, during the second term of Barack Obama, there was not that level of cooperation as liberal states and localities began to turn against the aggressive enforcement of these laws. And what Trump is trying to do is to punish, to sanction, to bully any sanctuary state or city into cooperating or to force them to pay the price if they don't. We will have to see. Obviously, Donald Trump visited California, visited Los Angeles, where the terrible fires have done all the destruction. And yesterday it looked like Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump would get along on this issue and that Trump was not going to try to use disaster relief as a cudgel with which to force California to change immigration policies. But we will have to see if that holds up or if that was temporary. So I'll just add then one more piece of recent news, and that is the firing of the 17 inspector generals that happened late at night last night. And in fact, at least when I was reading the paper this morning, had not been officially confirmed by the Trump administration. But what we're hearing from the agencies where the inspector generals work is, yes, the inspector generals have been fired. And these, of course, are officials created in the aftermath of Watergate, whose job it is to be a critical avenue within a administrative agency to detect and sanction malfeasance, illegality, corruption. And again, they were impediments to Trump fully enacting his agenda in his first term. He is clearly, I think, in part pursuing policies that are designed to allow him to be more effective, more efficient in his second term. He's also pursuing an agenda of punitive or vindictive punishment of those who he sees as critics or who he simply doesn't like. Removing the security detail from Dr. Anthony Fauci, I think, would be a clear example of that. And I think it's not just right that Trump is a vindictive man. It's also, again, that he campaigned on the idea that there are a large number of Americans who have been poorly treated by, who are not respected by the elite, and that he will be their instrument of revenge, that there's a deep mistrust on the part of a large number of Americans of expertise in general, and that Donald Trump is going to be a vehicle for putting the experts in their place. We're seeing this already in these relatively minor, but I worry ultimately much more systematic initiatives, right? And so to pivot to that for a moment, the idea that the United States has withdrawn from the World Health Organization and done so as an avian flu, H1N1.
Passion for myself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is spreading
It just
globally.
sort of happened.
I'm going to mute everyone, as you might be able to hear. We're getting a little background noise. Feel free, as always, to unmute yourselves and ask a question at any point. But the idea that in a situation where we have a rapidly spreading avian flu, where we have, as you're all too aware, norovirus spreading relatively rapidly, where I think, and this goes back to discussions we've had in the past, we are reckoning with a more vulnerable world where more human beings live at the so-called human wildlife interchange, that the result is that there's a greater opportunity for viruses to cross over into the human population in a world that is therefore in need of greater cooperation on public health issues, as opposed to pursuing that. The Trump administration, because it doesn't like the way WHO handled the coronavirus, pulls out of this organization. And what that means is that this organization will not share information with the United States, and the United States will not share information with this organization. And essentially, it means that we are putting blinders on, only looking at the information we generate domestically as opposed to trying to get a global public health perspective. It is potentially self-damaging, potentially dangerous. You combine that with the fact that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, have been told not to publish any information, and also had all of their travel and grant making capacity frozen in the first week. Let us hope that this is temporary and that this will be quickly restored. But again, I think the idea that there's a kind of hostility to the expert class as an insular elite that has given, right, bad news to the American public for too long, that has tried to restrict their liberty, that is telling them that global climate change is real and that they have to change their behavior, that the coronavirus is real. A class that admittedly makes mistakes and may, in fact, have unfair access given how expensive education is in the United States, but nevertheless also has genuine expertise and a capacity to help to protect us from real health risks. It is, I think, worrisome that this is the direction this administration is taking. Some of this stuff, again, I think is purely theatrical, declaring that there's only two sexes, and then, by the way, doing so in a way that makes it appear that everybody is female, because, of course, that's the way the zygote starts life. Terminating DEI programs across all federal agencies, removing protections for transgender people in federal prisons. yes, people will be harmed by this, but I think, frankly, the bigger picture is a politics of culture war that is taking hold in the United States and increasingly has an ally now in Washington. Having said that, I do want to focus in particular on one executive action that I think is really important. And this is revoking an executive order that goes all the way back to Lyndon Johnson, the order barring discrimination in federal contracting, right? And this is the basis of a lot of affirmative action within the federal government. And again, day one, the Trump administration rescinds that order, and the result is now the basis for affirmative action in federal contracting will be suspended or revoked for the next 4 years. This stuff, right, there were some trial and some provisional efforts to reduce prices on prescription drugs to maybe limit out-of-pocket expenses at a very low level. Immediately, Trump reverses that. And then tariffs, right? And here I'll be really quick about this. The idea that the uh, tariffs, right, central part of Trump's campaign, have not, in fact, been implemented. The question of whether they will be implemented on February 1st, Trump has announced that he intends on February 1st to target Mexico, Canada, China with with tariffs. It's I think, really interesting question. Does he mean it? Or are these merely threats, merely negotiating ploys that will ultimately be used to try to, for instance, get Canada to crack down further on fentanyl that's being smuggled into the United States from China, to try to get Mexico to rely less on Chinese goods and rely more on American goods? Or will Trump ultimately impose these tariffs? And the reason I say it's interesting and frankly, right, the idea that we're studying doing this as opposed to doing it is an indication that I think there's some awareness of the costs associated with doing this, that this is potentially extremely inflationary. It could prompt a trade war, that countries are better prepared to retaliate in 2025 than they were in 2018, 2019, when Trump first started banging the tariff drum, and that a president who is right coming in promising to bring inflation under control, berating his predecessor for the high level of inflation during his administration, does not want to prompt further inflation. Now, to move away from the details of the executive actions for a moment and to focus for a minute on the underlying logic of all of these executive actions, right? And part of this, I think, is, as I've said, a kind of shock and awe strategy. There's just so much that the Democrats and the unions and the civil society organizations won't know what to resist. And so progress will be made in implementing these initiatives before organized resistance can get in place, because there's just so much happening all at once. But I do think another aspect of this is the effort to say the Trump presidency, the second Trump presidency, will be a different kind of president than, frankly, the United States has had since Andrew Jackson. It will be a unilateral exercise of executive power that will aggrandize the office of the president. Let the president be a strong man, right? To really put his stamp on the direction the country moves, the federal policy, the cultural politics as well, and to do so without any checks and balances, without any procedural requirements, without any deliberation. This is all being done without Congress, and the hope is without judicial constraint, that this is then a movement in the direction of Viktor Orban, the idea of illiberal democracy, unchecked executive authority, um, is highly attractive to Donald Trump and apparently to Elon Musk and I mean I just am baffled by the use of the so-called Roman salute, something that certainly appears to be a replaying of Nazi political theater on the part of the richest man in the world, on the part of the man who tinkers with the algorithm of the most important political social media platform in the world whenever he wants to. Perhaps he is revealing his true colors as well. And then we add to that, right, the idea that the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6, 2021, in order to try to interfere with the Electoral College, appointing Joe Biden or confirming that Joe Biden won the presidential election, that all of them have been pardoned, right? And that includes people who are in leadership positions, people who were very violent in the way in which they tried to overcome the police barricades surrounding the Capitol. And the idea that what this sends is a message of impunity, right? That if you do political violence in support of that man, he has your back. He will, as long as he's in power, protect you. And the idea that it potentially creates a vigilante force to back up the president of the United States if the law, if legally constituted authority is insufficient, if things get caught up in the court, there is the potential for a alternative extra legal mechanism for enforcing the will of the President of the United States. I hope that this is not, in fact, the direction our country is moving in. But I think we need to recognize, right, the Republican Party is increasingly simply Donald Trump's party. We see this with the Pete Hegseth confirmation, right? The idea that there were only three Republicans who voted against a man who's dragging so much baggage with him and has so limited qualifications. This is purely a test of loyalty, of the ability of the president to force the Senate to do his will. There is, it seems to me, growing signs of autocratic ambitions. The idea of the vindictive use of presidential power to intimidate his opponents and his critics, right? Removing Fauci and Bolton's and Pompeo's security details, right? Not a general policy, a targeted attack on people who Donald Trump doesn't think are sufficiently loyal or who he just doesn't like. Again, it sends a message, and it's designed to be a chilling message. Now, having said all that, I will say again, and I think it's extremely important to recognize that the United States isn't Hungary, that the United States isn't Weimar, that this is a country with robust legal institutions, checks and balances, a constitution that has been in place for over 200 years, a judiciary where the vast majority of the members of the judiciary have life appointments and are lifetime appointments and are committed to the rule of law, even if we don't always agree with the judges or the justices on the details of how they interpret the Constitution and the law. I think there can be little doubt that there is a deep commitment to the principle of the rule of law. And then I would add civil society institutions, right? And this includes the press, this includes universities, this includes organizations that will hire lawyers, whether it's the ACLU or the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Southern Poverty Research Center, the Sierra Fund, the National Resource Defense Council. There are a whole bunch of organizations outside of the government that are going to do their best to stand up for civil liberties, to stand up for the law as interpreted. And I do think the question here is going to be whether or not this administration begins to target, right, universities, the press, not-for-profit organizations, begins to harry them and to make life difficult for them, to question their not-for-profit status, to use perhaps their loyalists to intimidate these organizations, and how much people will push back. I'm going to very briefly mention now the idea that perhaps the most important, the most significant area of action on the part of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, in its first week in office has been on environment, has been in particular on climate change, immediately withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, which, right, will take a year or two to take effect, but which is a clear signaling this is a top priority. We do not want to cooperate in a global effort to try to reduce carbon and other greenhouse emissions before it's too late, right? Obviously, Donald Trump seems genuinely not to be convinced by the overwhelming preponderance of scientific evidence and the severe danger that climate change presents. Again, part of an anti-elite, anti-expertise. We should just rely on our common sense, our gut. And by the way, look out the window. It doesn't look so bad out there. What's all this chicken little, is that, yeah, right? The sky is falling rhetoric about climate change anyway. And so the idea that the Biden administration, in ways that we talked about recently, made more progress on climate change than any presidential administration prior to it, and that Donald Trump and his administration is going to do everything in its power to not only reverse course, but to dismantle almost everything that the Biden administration has done. I'm going to point to a couple of specific things that I think are extremely important here and maybe not received enough attention. One of them is rescinding the 2009, so right, that's an Obama era, early Obama era finding of the Environmental Protection Agency, both enabled by and then upheld by a variety of court decisions, that the Clean Air Act of 1972, part of the enabling legislation for the Environmental Protection Agency, allows the EPA to regulate gases or emissions that endanger human health. And the finding is that carbon dioxide, methane, nitric oxide, greenhouse gases endanger human health. And by the way, there is good scientific evidence that 9 million people a year die sooner than they would have as a result of climate change, right? And so this seems to be a sound finding on the basis of the science, but the Trump administration, day one, directs the EPA to revisit and ultimately to reverse that finding. And if this actually goes through, that will eliminate the EPA's capacity to do anything about greenhouse gas emissions for the entire period of the Trump administration. And again, here you see, right, the idea that the EPA has civil servants doing its work and that they understand the law and that they are not simply going to do what the president tells them to do, even though he is the president. If it contradicts what the law requires them to do, the second coming of Donald Trump, the second Trump administration, is more intelligent, more strategic, more targeted in its approach, and it's figured out exactly what it needs to do to take away the authority of civil servants to do things that thwart his agenda. This is often called the holy grail of the petroleum industry, overturning the endangerment finding of 2009. And please remember that Donald Trump had a meeting with oil executives, originally closed door, but the transcript was leaked, I think, by the Washington Post, I believe in June of 2024, in which he said, raise $1 billion for me, and I will be elected, and then I will do all of this deregulation, and you will immediately be paid dividends on your investment in getting me to be the president. This is, I think, evidence that Donald Trump really meant it, that there was a quid pro quo, that a lot of money was raised for him by the oil industry, and that he's now going to pay back by removing the most important form of regulation that the EPA has over the petroleum industry. I put deregulating AI and encouraging cryptocurrency here because I think it's extremely important to recognize that what the petroleum industry really wants to do, this includes natural gas, of course, is to increase demand for their products so that what is right now a vast supply, right? The United States is producing more oil and natural gas in 2024 than it has at any time in its history. No reason to think that that won't continue to 2025. If the petroleum industry is really going to benefit, it's going to be because prices go up, because demand goes up. AI and crypto are incredibly energy intensive industries. They involve working multiple supercomputers at the same time. And so this is another aspect, I think, frankly, of the anti-climate change agenda of the Trump administration. I think I should stop there and open this up for questions. The next place I want to go is talking with you about the weakness of the Democratic Party and alternative paths for resistance. But I am mindful of the fact that we're essentially coming up on the end of our time together. So why don't I start by asking, were there things that I didn't cover from the first week of the Trump administration that you're particularly eager to talk about? Are there things that you're alarmed about or that you are perplexed about that you'd like us to discuss? Or are there other things that I didn't cover that you'd like to hear some discussion of? Who wants to start us out? Flossie, go ahead. Remember to unmute yourself, please, by pushing that space bar down. You're still muted, Flossie. Still muted. I'm sorry, Flossie, you're still muted. I'm gonna wait a moment for you to. Okay, yeah, we'll see if we can get somebody to help you, maybe. And in the meantime, I'm going to take David's question because I can see he's got his hand up. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I'm not in my apartment. Otherwise, I'd go across and help Flossie right now. But I just wanted to say that I think the big question for all of us is what do we do during this 4 year period? And do we engage in the conventional forms of resistance and survival? Join up with national efforts? Go onto social media? What is to be done? Because I think we all recognize the fact that our survival depends upon taking some sort of action. We can't just sit here and wait till till the LA fires spread everywhere. I think that I hope, I don't know if it's possible, but it would be useful, I think, to address avenues of either resistance or endurance.
Thank you, David. Uh, I'll be brief here today
Sure.
because this is a long and complex topic that I think requires, probably an hour of us talking together. But I want to say two things. And the first is that I think the literature by contemporary American political science, especially Daniel Schlossman, who I think is really good on this, the idea that political parties have to be anchored in civil society by civil society organizations that are pragmatic enough to work with political parties and that deliver, right, mobilization, grassroots organization, get out the vote campaigns, registration campaigns, knocking on people's doors to convince them to actually go to the ballot or turn their ballot in, right? That this is a model for success that the Democratic Party has moved away from in the post New Deal era, and that the result is that the Democratic Party does not have a basis in civil society, doesn't have deep roots or anchors in ordinary people, that it has, as a result, come to rely almost exclusively on large donors and large media and social media campaigns. Again, I think we see this with Kamala Harris spending over $1 billion, right? And having voter turnout go down dramatically, right? I mean, part of this may be that he just wasn't as effective a candidate, but I think a large part of it is structural, that the Democratic Party is not an effective political party in convincing ordinary voters in the 21st century that they care about what they care about, right? What the ordinary voter cares about. And so um, I'm going to suggest that for the next 4 years, two things are imperative. The first is to find alternatives to the Democratic Party. What we saw yesterday, last night, is that this incredibly weak candidate for one of the most important cabinet level positions got confirmed. There was just nothing the Democrats could do to effectively resist. And I don't think we want to locate our resistance in an party, an institution that is so ineffective, right? And so if that's the macro level, right? I started using this language at the very beginning. I moved away from it. The micro level is, you and me talking about this and maybe figuring out who we can help to know not to answer the door when ICE knocks on the door if they don't have a warrant, right? I think that's important. And I'm trying to do that with the people I'm connected to in my life. But that's the micro level. That's unlikely to be sufficiently powerful to generate the capacity to actually thwart the Trump agenda. Let us just pause for a moment and note that the Trump agenda, if actually passed, is likely to be counterproductive and damaging, right? Take the deportation agenda. If millions of people are deported, it's going to do tremendous economic damage, because those are people who are working and providing services that all of us rely on. It's also going to do tremendous moral damage to civil society. The kids our kids and grandkids go to school with are going to be yanked out of school and disappeared. People who take care of us, people who we have relationships, people who are married and have been in this society for a very long time, people who we know have escaped war or poverty or violence to come to this country are going to be sent back into harm's way. This is ultimately going to be destructive and unpopular. I'm pretty confident of that because, right, it's easy on social media to talk about an invading horde coming from the South. Once you actually begin to deport people who are already here and who are contributing members of our society, the rhetoric falls away and the human face and the actual economic damage done is clear. And so then the question is, how do we resist this where we live in our community, at what I'm calling the meso, the middle level? And can we build organizations that are like the organizations that anchored the Democratic Party in the middle of the 20th century? Organizations that don't just ask us to write checks and don't just hire lobbyists and media consultants to try to lobby and win elections, but that actually organize us. That is, I think, where the real opportunity of the next 4 years is, and that's what I want to address in detail in a coming lecture. So I like your idea, David, and I am definitely going there.
No, I'm fine to put it up. I just wanted to, sort of express that frustration that I think we all feel about what is to be done other than waiting for Trump to fail. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and organize, organize, organize is my response. But then that's a muscle that we haven't used for a long time. It's atrophied. We need to take initiative in building organizations that don't currently exist. Flossie, I see that you succeeded in getting yourself unmuted.
This is a
Congratulations. What do you have to share with
bit
us?
of trivia. What is Trump doing opening up the Kennedy assassination? What's in it for him or us? Whom is he after? What does he want with that?
Yeah, so I'll be brief. I don't have any great answer in terms of inside information. I do have a general interpretive framework. He wants Americans to believe that there's a deep state, that there are conspiracies on the part of the elite to keep important knowledge from them, and that the cover up of the Kennedy assassination, of the King assassination, the lack of transparency is indicative of the elite's mistrust of ordinary Americans, of a deep state that isn't accountable to ordinary people. And so he's going to open the files for everybody to see. That's my reading of it. But I'll say one more thing, which is that this kind of politics is classic bread and circus, right? Give the people something juicy, something entertaining, something scandalous or salacious to pay attention to, and then they may not notice, oh, wait, he said he was going to
Exactly.
raise
Yes.
our wages and decrease prices, and neither of those things is happening.
That's precisely, I couldn't understand it as anything else. More dirt in that direction. We don't look at the dirt that's happening right now under our very noses.
Yes,
Thank you. Good.
you bet, Flossie. Anybody else with a thought or a comment for today? All right. This is going to be a long 4 years. We will navigate it together. We will sustain ourselves through discussion, criticism, hopefully some insight. You all be well. It's good being with you as always, and I will see you next Saturday. Thank you guys. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you.